Jack Harrow's ranch sat like a scar on the Arizona landscape, 50 miles from the nearest town and a world away from civilized company. The buildings were functional but forbidding. A squat adobe house with barred windows, corrals built like fortresses, and warning signs posted along the single dirt road that led to his property. Those signs, written in English, Spanish, and crude pictographs, carried a simple message: keep out or die. At 42, Jack had earned his reputation as the most dangerous man in the Arizona Territory through a combination of quick-draw skills, explosive temper, and a complete lack of mercy for anyone who crossed him. His face bore the scars of countless fights, a broken nose never properly set, a jagged line across his left cheek from a knife fight in Tombstone, and cold grey eyes that seemed to look through a man rather than at him. He'd been alone on the ranch for 8 years now, ever since the incident that had driven him into self-imposed exile. The townspeople of Copper Creek still whispered about that night, how Jack had killed 3 men in a saloon fight, then calmly walked out while their blood pooled on the wooden floor. The territorial marshal had ruled it self-defense, but the way Jack had handled his gun, the complete absence of emotion on his face as he dealt death, it had marked him as something more than dangerous. It had marked him as inhuman, which was exactly how Jack preferred it. On this particular October evening, he stood on his porch, watching storm clouds build over the Dragoon Mountains, their dark mass promising the kind of desert thunderstorm that could wash out arroyos and turn the dry creek beds into raging torrents. The wind was already picking up, carrying the scent of rain and something else, dust kicked up by many horses moving fast. Jack's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 on his hip. In 8 years of isolation, unexpected visitors had meant only 2 things: trouble or death. Usually, both. The riders appeared through the dust and approaching darkness like phantoms, 15 figures on horseback, moving with the fluid coordination that marked them immediately as Apache warriors. Even in the failing light, Jack could see they were exhausted, their horses lathered and stumbling with fatigue. Most men would have reached for their rifles and started shooting. Jack Harrow simply stood motionless on his porch, his hand resting on his gun butt, and waited to see what these Apache wanted with him. The lead rider approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. He was a man in his 50s, grey-streaked hair hanging loose around a face marked by war paint and years of hard living. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "We seek shelter from the storm," he called out, his voice carrying over the rising wind. "We have women and children with us who cannot travel further tonight." Jack's eyes moved over the group, noting details with the automatic assessment of a man who had survived by being observant. There were indeed women among them. 4 Apache women, 2 of them clearly mothers holding small children. The men were armed, but carried their weapons with the casual ease of people who weren't planning immediate violence. "This is private property," Jack replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "Move on. The storm comes quickly," the Apache leader persisted. "The women and children need shelter. We ask only for 1 night's protection from the weather, and I'm asking you to leave," Jack said, his tone dropping to the dangerous quiet that had preceded the death of many men. "Now!" The Apache warrior studied Jack's face for a long moment, clearly recognizing the threat he represented. But instead of backing down, he dismounted and walked closer to the porch, stopping just outside the range where Jack could draw and shoot effectively. "I am Naich, son of Cochise," the man said with simple dignity. "These are my people, what remains of my band after the soldiers drove us from our homes. We have been riding for 3 days without rest, seeking passage to the Mexican mountains where we might find peace. We ask for shelter not as beggars, but as human beings caught in the path of a storm that could kill our children." Jack felt something twist in his chest at the mention of children, but he pushed the feeling down ruthlessly. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness got you killed. "Find shelter somewhere else," he said coldly. "I don't want Apache trouble on my land. There is nowhere else within reach before the storm hits." Nietzsche replied. You have large buildings, room for horses and people. We would be grateful for any shelter you could provide. Jack looked at the approaching storm clouds, now almost overhead and crackling with lightning. The wind was howling across the desert, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. In another 10 minutes, this would be a full-blown desert thunderstorm that could kill anyone caught in the open. Please, one of the Apache women called out in broken English, holding up a child who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. Child is sick, needs warm, dry place. Jack stared at the woman and child, and for just a moment his carefully maintained emotional walls cracked. He remembered another child, another stormy night, another moment when he could have made a different choice. One night, he said abruptly, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. You can shelter in the barn and the old bunkhouse, but your weapons stay outside, and if anyone so much as looks at me wrong, you'll all be eating bullets for breakfast. Nietzsche nodded gravely. We accept your terms, Jack Harrow. How do you know my name? Jack asked suspiciously. Your reputation travels far, Nietzsche replied. We know you as a man who kills without hesitation, but we also know you as a man who does not lie. If you give us shelter, you will honor that promise. Jack stared at the Apache chief, unnerved by the man's calm assessment of his character. Get your people settled before this storm hits. And remember, one wrong move, and you're all dead. As the Apache began unloading their horses and settling into the offered shelter, Jack retreated to his house and barricaded the door. Through his windows, he watched them work with quiet efficiency, the women tending to children and preparing what food they had, the men caring for horses and checking the security of their temporary shelters. They moved like a family, he realized, like people who cared for each other and took responsibility for each other's welfare. It was a kind of cooperation Jack hadn't seen in 8 years of isolation, and it stirred feelings in him that he'd thought were dead and buried. The storm hit with the full fury of the Arizona desert, turning the night into a chaos of wind, rain, and lightning. Jack sat in his kitchen, cleaning his guns by lamplight and trying not to think about the Apache families sheltering in his buildings. He'd made his choice based on practical considerations. Dead children on his property would bring the cavalry, and he didn't need that kind of attention. But as the storm raged outside and he listened to the faint sounds of voices singing softly in the barn, Apache lullabies, he realized, mothers comforting frightened children. Jack found himself confronting emotions he'd spent 8 years trying to kill. He'd given shelter to these people because it was the expedient thing to do. What he hadn't expected was how it would feel to have his ranch filled with life again, even temporarily. For the first time in 8 years, Jack Harrow was not alone. And despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain his isolation, part of him was discovering that he'd forgotten how much he missed the sound of human voices in the darkness. The dangerous rancher had opened his doors to strangers out of grim necessity. But as the storm howled around his fortress-like ranch, Jack was beginning to realize that some doors once opened could never be completely closed again. The transformation had begun, though neither Jack nor his unexpected guests had any idea how completely this single night would change all their lives. Dawn came gray and subdued to the Arizona desert, the storm having passed, but leaving behind a landscape transformed by flash floods and muddy arroyos that would take days to become passable again. Jack stood on his porch, surveying the damage while trying to ignore the sounds of his temporary guests stirring to life in the barn and bunkhouse. The Apache had been as good as their word. No trouble during the night. No attempts to enter his house or steal his property. They'd simply weathered the storm quietly and were now preparing to continue their journey south. Jack told himself he'd be glad to see them go and return to his carefully maintained solitude. Mr. Harrow, a voice called softly. Jack turned to see one of the Apache women approaching his porch, moving with the careful respect of someone who understood they were dealing with a dangerous man. She was younger than he'd realized the night before, perhaps 25, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of quiet dignity that reminded him uncomfortably of someone he'd once known. "What do you want?" Jack asked curtly. "My name is Maria," she said in careful English. "I am daughter to Nietzsche. I come to thank you for your kindness to our people." "It wasn't kindness," Jack replied flatly. "It was practical. Dead Indians on my land would bring the cavalry." Maria studied his face with the penetrating gaze that seemed common to her people. "You speak harsh words, but your actions show a different heart. The child who was sick, my nephew Little Fox, he is much better this morning because you gave us warm, dry shelter." Despite himself, Jack felt a flicker of something. Relief? Satisfaction? He couldn't identify the emotion, and that bothered him. "The kid's recovery has nothing to do with me," he said dismissively. "You Apache are tough. He'd have been fine either way." "Perhaps," Maria agreed, "but perhaps not. My people have a saying, kindness given in darkness shines brightest in the morning light." Before Jack could respond to this philosophical observation, Nietzsche himself appeared around the corner of the barn, leading his horse and clearly preparing for departure. The Apache chief approached the porch with the same measured dignity his daughter had shown. "Jack Harrow," Nietzsche said formally, "we are in your debt. You gave shelter when you had no obligation to do so. This is the action of an honorable man. Don't make more of it than it was," Jack replied gruffly. "I just didn't want the hassle of explaining dead bodies to the territorial authorities." Nietzsche nodded as if he understood perfectly, but his eyes suggested he saw through Jack's carefully maintained facade. "Nevertheless, we are grateful. If you ever have need of Apache assistance, send word through the trading post at Wilcox. We will come." Jack stared at the chief, unsettled by the sincerity of the offer. "I don't need help from anyone. No man is so strong that he never needs help," Maria observed quietly. "Even the mountain sometimes needs the support of other mountains to stand against the strongest storms." There was something in her tone that made Jack look at her more closely. She was watching him with an expression that seemed to see past his hostile exterior to something deeper, and it made him profoundly uncomfortable. "Your people need to be moving along," Jack said, turning away from her penetrating gaze. "The longer you stay in one place, the more likely the cavalry is to find you." "True," Nietzsche agreed. "But there is a problem. The storm has washed out the crossing at Devil's Creek. It will be 3 days, perhaps 4, before the water recedes enough for safe passage with the women and children." Jack felt his stomach sink. "You're saying you can't leave?" "We can try," Nietzsche said calmly, "but we would risk losing the children to the floodwaters." "Is this what you prefer?" Jack found himself caught between his desperate need for solitude and the practical reality that forcing these people to leave would likely result in dead children and all the complications that would bring. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. Then louder, "Fine, you can stay until the creek goes down. But the same rules apply. No weapons near the house. No one approaches me unless there's an emergency. And you stay out of my way." "We understand," Nietzsche replied with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "We will be as shadows, present but invisible." But over the next 2 days, Jack discovered that having 15 Apache living on his property was anything but invisible. Despite their obvious efforts to remain unobtrusive, he found himself constantly aware of their presence. The sound of children laughing as they played games in the corral. The sight of women tending a small garden they'd planted with seeds from their supplies. The quiet efficiency with which the men repaired storm damage to his buildings without being asked. It was this last point that bothered Jack the most. He'd built his isolation on the principle of self-reliance. He needed no one, and no one was allowed to help him. But every morning he woke to find small improvements to his property. Loose boards nailed back into place, damaged fence posts replaced, his water trough cleaned and repaired. "I told you people to leave my property alone," Jack said on the second morning. Confronting Nietzsche near the barn. "We have touched nothing that belongs to you personally," Nietzsche replied carefully. "But we have repaired damage caused by the storm. This is simple courtesy. When someone gives you shelter, you leave their home in better condition than you found it. I don't want your help, Jack said flatly. Yet you accept it, Maria observed, appearing beside her father with that unsettling directness of hers. Your words say one thing, but your actions say another. You could have stopped us from making these repairs, but you did not. Jack glared at her, frustrated by her ability to point out contradictions in his behavior that he hadn't even recognized himself. Don't presume to understand me, woman. You don't know anything about who I am or what I've done. I know you're a man who has chosen loneliness over companionship, Maria replied without flinching from his hostile stare. I know you carry grief that you try to bury with anger. And I know that despite your harsh words, you have shown nothing but honor in your dealings with my people. You don't know what you're talking about, Jack said. But his voice lacked its usual edge. Don't I? Maria stepped closer, her dark eyes searching his face. I see a man who once cared deeply for others, but was hurt so badly that he decided it was safer to care for no one. I see someone who has convinced himself that being alone makes him strong, when it only makes him empty. Jack felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, a mixture of anger and pain that he'd spent years keeping buried. You need to stop talking and mind your own business. Perhaps, Maria agreed. But perhaps you need someone to speak truths that you have been avoiding. Before Jack could respond to this uncomfortable observation, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Both Jack and the Apache immediately tensed, recognizing the steady rhythm of cavalry mounts moving at patrol pace. Soldiers, Nietzsche said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before he remembered Jack's rules about arms. Jack studied the dust cloud approaching from the north, calculating numbers and timing. 6 riders moving slow, probably a patrol checking on storm damage. He looked at Nietzsche grimly. If they find you here, there's going to be trouble. We can hide in the canyon behind your property, Nietzsche suggested. No time, Jack replied, watching the riders draw closer. They're already too close. They'd see you moving. He paused, his mind racing through options. Get your people into the barn and the root cellar. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. What will you tell the soldiers? Maria asked. Jack looked at her for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised even him. I'll tell them I haven't seen any Apache. Now get out of sight before they get here. As the Apache melted away with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to hiding from the cavalry, Jack realized he'd just committed himself to lying to federal troops to protect people he'd known for less than 3 days. The dangerous rancher, who had lived alone for 8 years, was discovering that some loyalties developed faster than logic, and that the walls he'd built around his heart were more fragile than he'd ever imagined. The cavalry patrol was riding toward his ranch, and Jack Harrow was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to protect the strangers who had somehow become his responsibility. The cavalry patrol consisted of 6 troopers, led by a young lieutenant who had clearly never been this far into Apache territory before. Jack watched them approach from his porch, noting the nervous way they handled their weapons and the constant scanning of the horizon that marked inexperienced soldiers in hostile country. Afternoon. Sir, the lieutenant called out as they reined in their horses near Jack's porch. I'm Lieutenant Morrison, Arizona Territorial Cavalry. We're conducting patrols following last night's storm, checking for damage and other concerns. What kind of other concerns? Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. We've had reports of Apache raiders in the area, Morrison replied, his voice trying to project authority despite his obvious nervousness. Hostiles moving south toward Mexico. We're checking all ranches and homesteads to make sure there've been no incidents. Jack leaned against his porch railing, projecting the casual menace that had served him well for years. Haven't seen any Apache. Then again, I don't see much of anybody out here. Yes, sir, Morrison said, consulting a piece of paper. You be Jack Harrow, correct? The gentleman with the reputation? That depends on what reputation you're talking about, Jack replied with a cold smile. Morrison swallowed hard. The one that says you're handy with a gun and don't much like visitors. That reputation would be accurate, Jack confirmed. which is why if there were Apache on my property, they'd be dead Apache. One of the older sergeants rode closer to the porch, his weathered face showing the kind of experience that came from years of Indian fighting. Mr. Harrow, we're going to need to search your buildings. Just to be thorough, you understand? Jack felt his hand move instinctively toward his gun. Sergeant, I don't recall inviting you to search anything. With respect. Sir, the sergeant replied carefully, we have authority from the territorial government to search any property in pursuit of hostile Indians. And with respect. Sergeant, Jack said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that had preceded many violent encounters, I have authority from my Colt 45 to shoot anyone who sets foot on my property without permission. The tension stretched taut as 6 armed soldiers faced off against one man, but Jack's reputation preceded him. Everyone in the Arizona Territory had heard stories about his speed with a gun and his complete willingness to kill. Even outnumbered 6-1, he was not someone to be taken lightly. Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Harrow, surely you understand our position? If we don't search thoroughly and Apache slip through to Mexico, your position, Jack interrupted, is that you're suspicious of a man who's never given the cavalry any trouble, who's lived alone on this ranch for 8 years without bothering anybody, and who's telling you he hasn't seen any Apache. He straightened to his full height, his gray eyes boring into the young officer. My position is that I don't give a damn about your authority, your mission, or your concerns. This is my land, and you're not searching it. The standoff continued for long seconds, with the only sounds being the nervous shifting of horses and the wind whistling across the desert. Jack could practically see the calculation going on in the soldiers' minds. Was enforcing their search authority worth the risk of a gunfight with one of the most dangerous men in the territory? Finally, the sergeant spoke up. Lieutenant, maybe we should move on. Mr. Harrow's got a point about his property rights, and if he says there's no Apache here, the man's a known killer, Morrison replied, though his voice lacked conviction. How do we know he's telling the truth? Jack smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Lieutenant, you're new to this country, so let me educate you about something. I've killed men for a lot of different reasons. Self-defense, anger, business disputes, and just plain meanness. But I've never once killed a man because I lied to him first. When Jack Harrow tells you something, you can take it to the bank. The sergeant nodded approvingly. That's true, Lieutenant. Whatever else you might say about Mr. Harrow, his word is good. Morrison looked around at his men, clearly recognizing that none of them were eager for a confrontation with the notorious gunfighter. All right, he said finally. We'll take your word for it, Mr. Harrow, but if we find out you've been harboring Apache, you won't, Jack said flatly. Because I haven't seen any Apache on my property. After the patrol rode away, Jack remained on his porch for several minutes, watching them disappear into the distance. When he was certain they were gone, he called out, "You can come out now." The Apache emerged from their hiding places with the ghostly silence that had allowed them to remain undetected, even when soldiers were searching for them. Nietzsche approached the porch first, his weathered face showing something that might have been respect. "You lied to soldiers to protect us," the Apache chief observed. "This was not required by your agreement to give us shelter." "It was practical," Jack replied, though even he could hear how hollow the word sounded. "Having cavalry swarming all over my ranch would have been inconvenient." Maria appeared beside her father, her dark eyes fixed on Jack's face with that uncomfortable intensity. "You risked your life for people you barely know," she said quietly. "The soldiers would not have hesitated to kill you if they discovered your deception." "I can handle myself," Jack said dismissively. "Yes," Maria agreed. "But the question is why you chose to handle the situation this way. You could have simply told the truth and let us face the consequences of being discovered." Jack found himself caught off guard by the directness of her question. Why had he protected them? It would have been simpler, safer, more in keeping with his carefully maintained isolation to let the cavalry find the Apache and deal with the consequences. "I gave my word that you could shelter here until the creek went down," he said finally. "I don't break my word." even when keeping it puts you in danger?" Maria pressed. "Especially then," Jack replied without thinking, then stopped as he realized what he'd revealed about himself. Maria smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since they'd arrived. "Now you begin to sound like the man I suspected you were, beneath all the harsh words and threatening looks. Don't make the mistake of thinking you understand me," Jack warned. But his voice lacked its usual edge. "I understand more than you might think," Maria replied gently. "I understand that you are a man of honor who has convinced himself that honor is weakness. I understand that you have built walls around your heart, but cannot quite bring yourself to stop caring about others who need protection." Jack stared at her, disturbed by how easily she seemed to read past his defenses. "You don't know anything about my heart, don't I?" Maria stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "I see a man who has suffered great loss and decided that the only way to avoid more pain is to avoid all connection with other people. But I also see a man who just risked his life to protect strangers because it was the right thing to do." "You're reading too much into a practical decision," Jack insisted. "Am I?" Maria asked. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Jack looked down and was startled to realize she was right. His hands were indeed trembling slightly, the aftermath of the adrenaline from his confrontation with the cavalry patrol. But more than that, they were shaking because this Apache woman was seeing him more clearly than he'd allowed anyone to see him in 8 years. "The creek should be down in another day or two," he said, changing the subject abruptly. "You'll be able to move on then?" "Yes," Nietzsche agreed. "And when we do, we will carry the memory of your honor with us. My people do not forget kindness, Jack Harrow." As the Apache returned to their temporary shelters, Jack remained on his porch, staring out at the desert landscape that had been his only companion for so many years. Something fundamental had changed in the past few days. Though he wasn't sure exactly what, he'd given shelter to strangers, lied to federal troops to protect them, and found himself actually caring whether they reached safety. The dangerous rancher, who had lived alone for years, was discovering that isolation, once broken, was surprisingly difficult to restore, and Maria's penetrating gaze had shown him something he'd been trying to deny, that beneath all his carefully constructed hostility and independence, he was still capable of the kind of honor and sacrifice that he'd thought died with his family 8 years ago. The transformation that had begun with a request for shelter was accelerating, and Jack Harrow was beginning to realize that some changes, once started, couldn't be stopped or reversed. Tomorrow, the creek would be low enough for the Apache to continue their journey south. But the question that was keeping Jack awake at night was whether he could return to his old life of solitude after discovering how much he'd missed the sound of human voices in the darkness. Dissay, dangerous rancher, was about to face the most difficult choice of his life, whether to remain alone in his fortress of solitude or to risk everything by admitting that he needed something more than isolation to make his life worth living. The morning of the 4th day dawned clear and bright, with Devil's Creek running low enough for safe passage. Jack stood on his porch, watching the Apache prepare for departure, telling himself he'd be glad to return to his peaceful solitude while fighting a growing sense of emptiness. The transformation in his property over the past few days was remarkable. What had been a functional but grim collection of buildings now showed signs of care and life: repaired structures, a small garden blooming with desert plants, corrals that had been reinforced and improved. The Apache had indeed left his ranch in better condition than they'd found it. "We are ready to continue our journey," Nietzsche announced, approaching the porch with the formal dignity that Jack had come to respect. "The creek is low, and we can reach the Mexican border by tomorrow evening." "Good," Jack replied, though the word felt hollow in his mouth. "You'll be safer once you're across the border." "Perhaps," Nietzsche agreed. "Though safety is never guaranteed for our people, no matter which side of the border we occupy." He paused, studying Jack's face carefully. "You have given us more than shelter, Jack Harrow. You have given us hope that not all white men see Apache as enemies to be destroyed, Don't read too much into it, Jack said automatically. I just didn't want the hassle of dealing with dead bodies on my property. Nietzsche smiled, the expression suggesting he saw through Jack's defensive words. You continue to speak harshly while acting with honor. This contradiction tells me much about the man beneath the reputation. Before Jack could respond, Maria appeared leading her horse, her few possessions secured in a simple pack. In the morning light, she looked younger than he'd realized, but her dark eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much suffering in her young life. I want to thank you personally for your kindness, she said, approaching the porch steps. You have shown my people that courage and honor still exist in this harsh land. I haven't shown you anything except that I keep my word, Jack replied, though he found it difficult to meet her penetrating gaze. You have shown us much more than that, Maria insisted. You have shown us what it looks like when a man chooses to do right, even when it brings him no benefit and considerable risk. She stepped closer, and Jack caught a scent of sage and something uniquely feminine that made him acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd had a real conversation with a woman. Jack Harrow, Maria said softly, I want you to know that in our tradition, when someone saves our lives, we consider them family. You are now brother to our people, welcome in our camps wherever we may wander. I don't need family, Jack said quickly, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. Everyone needs family, Maria replied gently. Even those who convince themselves they are stronger alone. You don't understand, Jack said, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. I had family once. A wife, a daughter. They died because of what I am. The kind of man who attracts violence, who brings danger to everyone around him. The words came out before he could stop them, revealing the pain he'd kept buried for 8 years. Maria's expression softened with understanding and sympathy. And so you decided that living alone would keep others safe from the danger you represent, she said quietly. A noble sacrifice, but a lonely one. It's the only choice that makes sense, Jack insisted. Is it, Maria challenged, or is it the choice that allows you to avoid the risk of caring for others and possibly losing them again? Jack felt as if she'd struck him physically. No one had dared speak to him so directly in years, and the truth of her words hit him like a bullet to the chest. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I know about loss, Maria replied firmly. I've lost my mother, my brother, my first husband to the wars between our peoples. I know the temptation to close your heart rather than risk more pain. But I also know that a heart closed to pain is also closed to joy. There is no joy in my life, Jack said flatly. Only survival. There could be, Maria said, stepping even closer. If you chose to allow it, Jack stared at her, feeling something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead forever. Hope, longing, the possibility that his life could be something more than just existing from one empty day to the next. Maria, it's time to go, Nietzsche called out, having finished securing the last of their supplies. Maria nodded, but didn't immediately step away from Jack. We are going to the mountains south of Hermosillo, she said quietly. If you ever decide that solitude is not the answer to your pain, you would be welcome there. I won't be coming, Jack replied, though the words felt like they were being torn from his throat. Perhaps not, Maria agreed. But know that the invitation remains open. A man of honor always has a place among people who value honor. She started to turn away, then stopped and looked back at him one more time. Jack Harrow, you saved our lives and asked nothing in return. In our tradition, this creates an obligation. If you ever need help, send word. We will come. I won't need help, Jack said automatically. Everyone needs help eventually, Maria replied with a sad smile. Even dangerous men who live alone in the desert. As the Apache mounted their horses and prepared to ride out, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. The urge to call them back, to ask them to stay, to admit that he'd been wrong about the virtues of solitude. But the words wouldn't come. 8 years of isolation and self-imposed exile couldn't be overcome in a moment. no matter how much his heart might want things to be different. "Jack Harrow," nature called out as they began to ride away. "Remember, you are family to the Apache now. This is not something we give lightly or take away easily." Jack raised his hand in acknowledgement but said nothing. He stood on his porch, watching the 15 riders disappear into the southern desert until even the dust of their passage had settled and he was alone. Again, the silence that followed their departure was more profound than any quiet he'd experienced during his 8 years of isolation. The ranch felt empty in a way it never had before, as if something essential had been removed, along with his temporary guests. For the first time since choosing exile, Jack Harrow began to question whether he'd made the right decision all those years ago. The Apache had shown him that he was still capable of honor, courage, and selfless action. More disturbing, they'd shown him that he was still capable of caring about other people, despite all his efforts to kill that part of himself. Days passed, then weeks, but Jack found he couldn't return to his old routines. The improvements the Apache had made to his ranch served as constant reminders of their presence, and he caught himself listening for the sound of voices that would never return. He told himself that isolation was strength. But Maria's words haunted him. "A heart closed to pain is also closed to joy." Had he traded the possibility of happiness for the certainty of emptiness? Winter came early to the Arizona desert that year, and with it came news from the south. A Mexican trader, stopping at Jack's ranch for water, mentioned that a band of Apache had been attacked by bandits near Hermosillo. The details were sketchy, but there had been casualties. Jack felt his blood turn to ice. "What happened to the survivors?" "Nobody knows for sure," the trader replied. "Some say they scattered into the mountains. Others say they were all killed." That night, Jack sat alone in his empty house and made the most difficult decision of his adult life. He couldn't continue living with the possibility that people who had touched his heart might be dead or suffering, while he remained safely isolated in his fortress of solitude. The dangerous rancher, who had lived alone for years, was about to embark on a journey that would either reunite him with the family he'd found and lost, or confirm that his decision to remain isolated had been the